Welcome to the Enterprise Faith-Based Development Initiative Annual Summit for 2024. We are excited to have over 900 people from across the country who have registered for today's event. Many thanks to all of you for joining us today. I want to start by thanking our sustaining sponsor, Wells Fargo, who we will hear from later. And we want to say thanks to our presenting sponsor, Capital One. Enterprise launched our Faith-Based Development Initiative, which we like to call FBDI, back in 2006 with the goal of helping to create new additional affordable homes and community facilities on land that is owned by houses of worship, by helping houses of worship to make informed go and no-go decisions. We also note goals of supporting equitable procurement opportunities for BIPOC vendors, strengthening neighborhood anchor institutions, and building an enterprise program that includes, but is much larger than enterprise. The theme for this year's summit, the evolution of a movement, faith-based development and progress on the public policy front, will have us exploring efforts to expand this growing national movement. I'm grateful for all of the speakers who will be joining us today. Their full bios are linked on the summit page of the Enterprise website, and we invite you to check those out. To kick us off today, I'm pleased to introduce Reverend Dr. Marlon Harris to offer our invocation. Dr. Harris is the founding pastor of New Life Church in Decatur, Georgia, and is a participant in the Enterprise Southeast Region FBDI cohort in Atlanta. Dr. Harris, thank you for joining us today, and now I turn it over to you to bring us our invocation.
My privilege. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Shall we pray together? Our Father, we come before you today with hearts full of gratitude for this gathering of minds and hearts and hands committed to building homes of hope and dignity for families across this nation. Oh God, you are the great architect. You are the builder of all things and the shelter of those in need. And so we gather in your presence today and we seek your guidance that you would bless the work of our hands and that you would bless this conference and its mission. Lord, we are reminded of your words which declare that unless you build the house, they that build it labor in vain. So we call upon you now to bless our dreams, bless the plans of this organization and the plans of the many churches and places of faith across the country that are engaging in this great work of building quality, stable homes for families that are in need. We give you thanks for the leaders that are gathered here today, the faith leaders, the government officials, the advocates, and all the visionaries, including those who lead us from clergy. We ask that you would bless all of their efforts, Lord, that you'd strengthen and encourage them. And I pray, God, that you would also give discernment to each of us as we navigate the complexities involved in housing. Help us remember that you are a God of justice. You are a God who cares for the weak, the lost, and the vulnerable. And so, Lord, let our collaborations today bring great fruit that uplifts your name and fruit that helps to transform our communities. Oh God, we pray that as you have commanded us to care for those who are least among us, we pray now that you would give us the strength and power to do that, to clothe the naked and to shelter those who are homeless and to feed those who are hungry. And we pray that as we embark upon this endeavor, that we do it with your guidance, under your power, and by your hand. And so, Lord, may this day bring you glory. May every speaker, each panel, and all the topics that we will discuss, may all of it bring you great praise. We pray now that you'd be pleased with our efforts and our work. Look upon what we do and grant us your favor. We ask it all in the precious name of the Lord Jesus. And everyone said, amen.
Dr. Harris, thank you so much. We really appreciate you bringing us a word of encouragement and discernment in the prayer. Next, I am pleased to introduce the Enterprise CEO and President, Sean Donovan. Sean has spent much of his professional career working in the field of affordable housing and community development in both the public and private sector at the local and national level. Sean's early career involved work with faith-based development efforts, and I'm honored to turn it over to Sean to offer us some welcoming remarks today. Sean, I turn it over to you.
David, thank you so much. It is so wonderful to be with you all. And let me just say a word about David before I speak to you more broadly. We are so lucky at Enterprise to have the leadership of David Bowers. We often think of him as the conscience of Enterprise. He is a moral compass for all of us in the work that we do. He leads our most important region in the country, in the Mid-Atlantic, the home of Enterprise. And David, thank you for bringing this group together. Even more importantly, thank you for your decades of building what is the premier faith-based program in the country to develop affordable housing. Thank you for your leadership. As David mentioned, but maybe I can say it a little more starkly, I would not be here today. I would not be a houser if it were not for the leadership of a faith-based houser. As a student, I heard about the remarkable efforts of the Nehemiah program in my hometown of New York. For those of you who don't know, Nehemiah was a faith-based effort that rebuilt huge neighborhoods across New York, the South Bronx, East Brooklyn, areas that had been devastated by fires, by abandonment. And the leader of that effort was then Reverend, now Bishop, Johnny Ray Youngblood. And I was so inspired by his work that I followed him to 10-day community organizing training. And when I finished, I basically said to Bishop Youngblood, put me to work. And I'll never forget, he said to me, Sean, there are two forms of power: organized people and organized money. We are organizing the people, you go organize the money. And so I went to work at the nonprofit that was raising the capital for all of the rebuilding that the Nehemiah program was doing. And that was how I got started in this housing journey. And I will say, in many ways, that is exactly the work that Enterprise does and has been doing since 2006 that you heard from David about. We are organizing money and people to help you do what you want to do with your land, to put that toward community purpose with affordable housing. We've been doing that since 2006, almost 20 years. And we are now working at a scale that was unimaginable thanks to David's leadership and our partnership with all of you. We're operating multi-year cohorts in 11 cities across the country, working with more than 140 houses of worship that are projected to build more than 9,000 new affordable homes. We also have a new, really exciting collaboration with the Church of God in Christ to support the denomination's work with 200 of their congregations. And we're hoping to build more than 18,000 units of affordable housing across the country as part of that effort in the coming years. So we have been doing this work in deep and broad ways. But I want to say this is a particular moment that we gather where this housing crisis that our nation is facing is worse than I have seen in my 3 decades of doing this work. It is deeper. We have a record number of our neighbors sleeping on our streets and in shelter. We've seen record levels of home prices and rents higher than we've ever recorded in the history of this country. And so this is a moment where this work is more important than ever. And what is remarkable is that we are seeing a growing political consensus that we need to do more, with faith-based development at the forefront of that work. Housing affordability came up 5 times in the presidential debate this year. More than 30 governors in their State of the State addresses talked about housing affordability. In my 3 decades of doing this work, I've never seen that before. And more of those governors, more and more of local leaders, more and more of our national, federal leaders are talking about faith-based development as a bipartisan solution to our housing crisis. And so we gather at a very important time for this summit today. And I want to thank you for being part of that work at a time when this work has never been more important. We are here to partner with you and to do whatever we can to support your vision for your congregations and your communities. I also want to say that we offer a special thank you to our sustaining sponsor. As David mentioned, Wells Fargo has provided significant support for this work across the country. So deep a thank you to Stacy Spann from the Wells Fargo Foundation, who's joining us today. I also want to say a special thank you to my close friend, Acting HUD Secretary Adrian Todman, who is a wonderful leader on this work and in so many other ways. And I also want to thank Senator Gounardes, who's with us today, and all of the other participants that are part of this. I hope that this conversation will provide you not just with the information, but with the inspiration that will lead to new frontiers, new homes, new communities, and are part of your faith communities across the country to solve the deepest housing crisis our nation has ever faced. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for your leadership. David, thank you for bringing us together today.
Sean, thanks so much. Very much appreciate your remarks, and thank you for the kind words at the outset. We appreciate your leadership in this space and look forward to continued work with you. As Sean mentioned, we are pleased to be joined. It's my pleasure to introduce Stacy Spann. Stacy is the head of Housing Access and Affordability Philanthropy at the Wells Fargo Foundation. This proud Morehouse man has over 25 years of experience in the affordable housing and community development field, working in both the public and private sector, leading agencies and efforts to expand equity and creative housing for avenues for economic opportunity for low-wealth children, families, and seniors. He is a man I like to describe as a man who can and a man who cares. We're grateful for that significant catalytic support that Wells Fargo has provided for enterprise work over the years. As Sean referenced, it's been critical to the program's growth. Stacy, want to thank you for being with us today, and now I turn it over to you.
Well, I want to start by thanking David and the team at Enterprise Community Partners for having me here to speak to you all. And I also want to thank you for being here. I'm encouraged and inspired by all of your hard work and dedication to your communities, and that's demonstrated by your virtual presence here, but the work that you're doing every single day. Once again, I'm Stacy Spann, head of Housing Access and Affordability with the Wells Fargo Foundation, and I lead strategies that are focused on strengthening historically marginalized children, families, and communities, as well as helping them build generational wealth through driving innovation, opening doors to access, and keeping people housed. Housing is a basic right. We all know that. I've said it dozens of times before at this point, but the housing that you are building and partnering to build sets the foundation for building wealth and opportunity. And we recognize that there are cost and equity barriers to this work, this most fundamental need. And now more than ever, we need to continue to cleave together, to work hard and house folks often and well. We're at a pivotal moment, and this is going to determine how we're shifting and how we're housing, how we're supporting people. And of course, we need to work together and use every single tool in our toolbox, not only to advocate for the folks that make up this wonderful country, but to do more for those folks. And it cannot just be housing. This has to be a holistic approach. And that would encompass financial health and sustainability, small business growth, to create enduring and positive change. Wells Fargo possesses significant human capital and financial resources, and we're supporting families and children in our communities. And most especially, we're focused on those communities that have been at the center of historic marginalization, who are depending on us to find the right solutions to move from disinvestment and marginalization to equity in housing. Since 2019, Wells Fargo has invested more than $710 million to help address housing access and affordability issues nationwide, including supporting keeping people housed through available and affordable rentals, as well as homeownership opportunities. Together, Wells Fargo and Enterprise cannot do this work without leaders in faith and houses of worship. Houses of worship are often the beacon of support for communities. It's fitting that these houses of worship are coming together now to work on this housing crisis. Our leaders in faith work are tirelessly working every single day to serve families and children, and they know firsthand where that support is needed. It's our responsibility to support these faith leaders and give them the tools they need to serve. If we work together, we can create opportunities for community to be more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. Families and community and those children who live there. How can we work for them and to make their lives better? We really appreciate being a part of this tremendous effort, and thank you all for all you'll do and what the future offers us.
Stacey Spann, many thanks. Really appreciate you being here with us today. We appreciate your remarks and appreciate, again, the continued catalytic support Wells Fargo and the Wells Fargo Foundation have provided. We will now transition to our first panel. The theme is Yes in God's Backyard, Progress on the State and Local Policy Front for Faith-Based Development. I'm pleased to be joined as a co-moderator by my colleague, Patrick Boyle. Patrick is a senior director who leads policy efforts with our New York office. And our panelists today include elected officials from across the country, and we're grateful for them being with us. Andrew Gounardes, a state senator from New York. Strom Peterson, state representative from Washington State. Kate Stewart, who is a council member in Montgomery County, Maryland. And Scott Wiener, state senator from the great state of California. We appreciate all of you all for being with us today. We know that this work really is at the intersection of what I like to refer to as radical common sense, working with mission-aligned entities that own often underutilized land that exists in a sea of need, a need for affordable housing and community facilities like affordable childcare, healthcare facilities, healthy food options. So we're really looking forward to this conversation with our elected officials who are really there on the ground, our elected public servants. So Patrick, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick us off with our first question.
Thank you so much, David. Appreciate all our panelists and everyone here listening to this important discussion today. First question is for you, Representative Peterson. In 2019, the Washington State Legislature passed a law in support of faith-based development. Talk to us a little bit about what that law does, and given that it's been a couple years since its passage, what you've seen as the impact, both in terms of the development it spurred and also the kind of the way in which it shifted the conversation there in Washington.
Sure, great. Thank you so much. And just an incredible honor to be here this morning on the West Coast, the afternoon for some of you people in other parts of the country. And I won't say anything about blizzards or snowstorms because it's been quite a lovely few days here. I'm just north of Seattle. Yes, this was a great bill that was brought forward with the help and leadership of a group we here have in Washington State called the Faith Action Network, which is a group of, I think it's 160 or so different faith organizations that get together and really advocate for policies around housing, poverty reduction, criminal justice reform, a whole host of issues. And they're just a wonderful force in Olympia down in Washington State. So they brought forth this idea originally in 2017, and it was really an opportunity to use property that is owned by faith communities to expand housing opportunities. So in short, if it's faith-based owned property, that you kind of get an upzone in the number of units that you can put on that property. It took a couple of years for it to gain traction. It didn't pass in its first year, but a couple of years later it did with the leadership of my colleague, Representative Amy Wallen, and ended up, again, after a couple of years of, as things happen in legislative worlds, with really broad bipartisan support. And originally a very good kind of collaboration with cities. The Association of Washington Cities really came to the table and tried to work out a deal to make sure that the cities kind of understood what was happening, that this was definitely going to be an expansion of housing opportunities. So there was some pushback with some cities, but they were able to kind of rally around. Since its passage, it passed in 2019. We all know what happened then, so it's hard to really gauge the true effectiveness of it. But there have been a couple of successes. There was a success, I think, in Seattle, where I think it was a Lutheran church was able to use its property to build housing. I think normally that piece of property would have been allowed under regular zoning about 60 units. They were able to build housing with 85 units. So that's a great success, and a couple of other cities have adopted this model and really been a little more progressive in doing that outreach. Unfortunately, there was kind of a loophole in some of the language to really kind of bring the cities on board, and it allowed cities kind of an out. If a city didn't really feel like they were having a considerable problem in housing, they didn't necessarily have to come to the table, even if a church or religious organization came to them and said, "Hey, we have this great idea of increased housing." There wasn't really a mandate for cities to cooperate. So that's been unfortunate, and I think that's been a bit of an impediment with what could be more successful. We have some other bills in Washington State kind of in similar veins to make sure that we can do this type of housing. And we're actually working on some ideas to strengthen the language a little bit more to make sure that cities are coming to the table. So I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about this bill and maybe looking at language. Our session starts in just over a month, to maybe look at this language and maybe strengthen it a little bit more to make sure that cities are coming to the table. As we know, land costs here in Western Washington especially are the primary driver for housing costs. And this is such an incredible opportunity. So hope I didn't ramble on too long. Again,
no, that's good,
being
Representative Peterson. We appreciate that. And you actually flagged something that we're going to come to a little bit later on about lessons learned in the process and what might be on the horizon as kind of 2.0 versions, if you would. So appreciate you flagging that. Senator Wiener, we're gonna transition to you with a question, and I'm excited because you were a panelist with us in 2020 at our FBDI summit, and you discussed legislation that you had introduced at the time to support faith-based development. And here we go, 4 years later, the legislation, often referred to as "Yes in God's Backyard," was recently passed and signed into law in California. So many congrats to you for the effort. So a couple of questions we had for you in the same vein. Why did you introduce the legislation? What will it provide to help houses of worship who are looking to develop affordable housing on their land? And what is the legislation's intended impact or potential impact as you all see it?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. And it's really exciting that this is happening around the country and beyond Yes in God's Backyard, just the pro-housing movement that has just taken off first, and it's at local level, state level, and the fact that Vice President Harris was talking about it from her lofty perch. So it's just very exciting how this movement has grown, and we're finally getting back to the good old fashioned way of doing housing, which is you build housing when people need housing, and as you grow, you build more homes. That's how human beings have done it from the beginning of time. And then about 50 years ago, we decided that things like views and parking and other things were more important than people having a roof over their head. So it's exciting. We in California, we have led the nation, probably with Hawaii, in generating a massive housing shortage. It's led to all sorts of problems. And I don't know if anyone saw recently in the Atlantic, Jerusalem Demzis wrote a really powerful piece about how, because blue states are like some of the worst offenders in not allowing housing, that New York, Illinois, California combined are going to lose 10 seats in the House of Representatives in the next redistricting. So that means 10 electoral votes, and the blue wall states will no longer be enough to put a Democrat over the top for president. And so in addition to the human cost and the economic cost not having enough homes, there is a huge political cost that we are going to face. And so we have been working in California to turn the ship around, to make it much easier and faster to get new homes approved, to force cities to stop zoning only for single family homes and to have more of a mix to zone for enough homes, and then to eliminate local discretion for in terms of being able to, for political reasons, reject new housing if the housing meets all of the requirements that have been set in terms of height, density, et cetera. So we've been doing this work in a number of respects. And here, it's very exciting. Yes, in 2020 was the first time that I introduced this bill. It caused an explosion with labor. And so we had to pull it back that year. I tried again in 2022, didn't work. Finally, in 2023, we got it done, and we built a massive, massive coalition, faith-based housing advocates, a number of labor unions that got on board, and we got it done. And the bill, it's very muscular. It was Senate Bill 4. It does two things. For any faith-based owned land, and we also included nonprofit colleges, that land is automatically rezoned for multi-unit, for dense enough to build affordable housing on it. Because one of the problems is frequently the church land or synagogue land, et cetera, is not even zoned for housing at all. And if it is, it's zoned only for single family homes. And cities just often will just refuse to do that rezoning. And so it's now automatically rezoned, period. In addition, if the project meets all of the requirements in terms of the allowable density in the outline in the law in SB 4, as well as meeting certain labor standards and some other standards, then it's automatically approved. It's ministerial approval, no discretionary approval, not subject to the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, which is what was supposed to be an environmental law that gets used by NIMBYs to stop things like housing. And so automatically rezoned, automatically approved. It's very exciting. We have this, it's only been in effect for less than a year. So we don't have that 5 years of experience. But I've heard from so many churches in particular and some synagogues up and down the state who are some of them are actually in advanced planning and are moving. And there have been some permits that have been pulled because their project was in advanced stages in terms of the planning, and other churches and synagogues are now just moving forward. So it's I think over time, it's going to produce a lot of new homes.
That's great. Thank you, Senator. Appreciate that. And kudos to you for the continued work that you did. And we heard Representative Peterson talk about the need to keep at it. Speaking of kind of on the more recent side here, even more recent, Councilmember Stewart, we really appreciate you being here with us from Montgomery County, Maryland. And there was legislation that you introduced at the local level that was recently enacted by the County Council in Montgomery County, Maryland. And we have some questions for you around similar to what we asked Senator Wiener. Why did you introduce the legislation? What would it provide to help the houses of worship looking to develop affordable housing on their land? And what do you think the legislation's intended or potential impact may be in Montgomery County?
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here today. So what we did, and it's less than a year, as you mentioned, was passed a zoning text amendment here in Montgomery County, Maryland. We called it FAITH, the FAITH ZTA, which stood for Facilitating Affordable, Inclusive Transformational Housing. And much like my colleagues from around the country have talked about, we were approached by houses of worship who, talked to us about their current situation, where many of them had seen dwindling congregations. They had available land and wanted to continue to work on their missions in our community of helping people, especially helping us address our housing crisis here in Montgomery County. And so we looked at their situation, and what we found is that as some of my colleagues have talked about, where there is property that houses of worship own, many times it is zoned for single family housing only when it is not being used as a house of worship. And what happened then is if they wanted to build multifamily housing or do something with that land, it was a very cumbersome, time-consuming process they had to go through. And so we introduced our ZTA in order to kind of help get us over that time-consuming process and to facilitate the building of affordable housing, whether for rental or home ownership on property that is owned by houses of worship. And we also included private schools as well in our zoning text amendment. This was really an idea that came from our houses of worship that we were working with. And one of the interesting things as we looked at and mapped out all the different faith institutions and private schools, across the county, we found we had over 525 properties that might be able to avail themselves of this type of zoning text amendment. And through that analysis, what we looked at was how far we could go in the county to not only address our housing crisis, but also to advance our racial equity work. Because like Montgomery County, like many counties and areas across the country, the history of our housing policy is one that is filled with discrimination and inequities. And we're no stranger to that here in Montgomery County. And so one of our goals also with this zoning text amendment was to make sure that it applied across the board in places in our county that had been subject to redlining or other types of impediments that were not allowing members of our community, particularly Black and Brown members of our community, to live or be homeowners. So that was a key component also of the legislation we passed. And it's less than a year old. And so we're hopeful. We've gotten a great response. And I know in the panel later today, you actually have one of the Pastor Willard Green is going to talk to you about their plans. And we're really excited to see the project they're working on.
That's great. Thank you, Councilmember. Really appreciate that. Patrick, turn over to you for our next question.
Thank you, David. Senator Gounardes, question for you. Thank you so much for being here. It's good to see you again. I'm a constituent of yours, so you can count today as good constituent services along with good housing policy as well. So you've introduced legislation at the New York State level around supporting some of this Yes in God's Backyard Faith-Based Affordable Housing Development Act activities. So talk a little bit about what your bill would do. And then as we go into a new legislative session, just interested to hear from you. Oftentimes these things can take years to really advance, and just interested to hear any feedback you've gotten, positive or negative, about that legislation and how you might be shaping either the bill or how we talk about the bill in order to have it see progress in this upcoming session.
Yeah, well, great. Thank you, Patrick. And, anytime you need a pothole filled, you know where to go. We're here to help. And thank you to everyone. By and large, the kind of the rationales that my fellow co-panelists have talked about for the impetus for their respective bills are the same reasons why I introduced the Faith-Based Affordable Housing Act. I actually first learned about it hearing or reading about Scott's first attempt early on, when New York has really been trying to figure a way to dig ourselves out of the deep housing crisis that we are in. In New York City, for example, we've only built 185,000 homes over the last decade, while we have created like 800,000 plus jobs and attracting new people to the city. So we're nowhere near the level of construction we need to be seeing in order to keep our heads above water, let alone continue to grow as a city. And this is one of the biggest reasons why families are leaving New York, is because of the lack of housing for them. Families can't afford to stay here because they can't grow in their communities. We're not building housing that suits the needs of families and so many other folks. And so a couple of years, New York, under our governor, undertook a really aggressive swing at trying to tackle the housing crisis. And it was called the Housing Compact. It would put all of these mandates on every jurisdiction in the state. And it got significant pushback, as no surprise there. And nothing really came out of those legislative efforts. And For me, as I saw this unfolding and how that was affecting my own district, where we have in the pipeline about 8 to 10,000 units being constructed right now, I realized that we have to take some bite-sized chunks in order to work our way towards our goals, and that 4 singles is just as good as a home run sometimes. And so I introduced the Faith-Based Affordable Housing Act on the premise that these institutions are already trusted pillars in our community, and that given the scale and scope of the land that they already own throughout the state, we estimate it's nearly about 0.75% to 1% of all the developable land in the state. That's actually quite significant for a state the size of New York. And we can go a significant way toward addressing the housing crunch by making it easier for these institutions that want to be in the business of providing housing for not just their own congregations, but for the broader community, make it easier for them to do so. In the course of our research and work, we learned about one community in particular that took 11 years to get the approvals to build 30 units of housing. That's criminal. And so that's why this is so important. We introduced the bill about 2 years ago. And in the last 2 years, we have made significant progress in growing our coalition of pro-housing community members, pro-housing members of the legislature, our faith-based community. And as we're gearing up for the start of our legislative session this coming January, this is going to be one of my top priorities to try to push through. I think there is a moment here where we can actually do something meaningful. And in particular, because New York City itself is in the process of actually today voting on a pretty significant zoning text amendment change. It's called the City of Yes, which will unleash the potential to build 80,000 new units. Still nowhere near where we need to be, but it's a step. And included in the City of Yes is a similar version to make it easier for faith-based institutions to develop affordable housing as of right. And so if we can do this in New York City right now, I think that'll take a significant give a significant boost to our efforts to do the same thing in every corner of the state. It's not without challenges, though. One of the biggest, two of the biggest sources of opposition that we've been encountering in this work from the very beginning has been the consistent, obstruction of NIMBYs who don't believe that housing construction and housing supply will help address the housing crisis, or just don't care because they have a home and a roof over their heads. That's number one. And then secondly, we've encountered significant opposition, misinformed, of course, from the preservationist community, which feels like this is a license to just tear down historic churches and put up, ugly 30-foot towers. And that's not true at all. Our bill has specific protections for buildings that have historic protections. This is not a requirement that every church develop housing. All we're saying is, if you want to be in the business of building housing that meets the needs of our cities and our communities, we believe it should be easier for you to do it as of right. And so that is kind of the back and forth we're engaging with. But I think that we have grown significant momentum over the last year in particular. I'm excited by what the city is about to do today and how that's going to help us in our efforts moving forward once we go back to Albany in January.
Senator, thanks for that. And I want to open up a question to all of you all. And so feel free to jump in on this, but we've heard the question is really about lessons learned, right? And we've got an audience on the line today. Others will be watching this video, right, in the weeks and months ahead. And so it is part of the point of this kind of conversation is to, and we even heard this, a senator from New York say, hey, I was looking at what folks did in California, that we can learn from each other at the state and local level across the country. So again, appreciate you all being here. So the question is really around what lessons did you learn in crafting the legislation and working to get it enacted that you can share with other state and local elected officials and non-government folks who may be just interested in getting this kind of work passed to get these policies enacted. And I just want to say I was making some notes here. I've heard issues around NIMBY, issues around preservationists. We heard issues around some initial opposition from labor. On the kind of what I'll call the positive side, I heard both the Councilmember Stewart and Senator Gounardes talk about the notion of what I call case making. How much potential is there, right? 0.1% of the developable land, 525 lots and the like. So curious, for pro and con, lessons that you all have learned that you can share with anybody. So anybody want to take a first bite at that?
I can jump in.
Sure.
So I think, one of the things, there are a couple of things, but two I would emphasize for us is really working with the community members on this. Because as I said, we had a number of faith institutions, and I'm sure this is the same across the country, that each situation is so unique. Right. We have some of these houses of worship that are very close to a vibrant urban core downtown, and thinking about how they're going to develop that land is very different than a house of worship that might be out in an area that has, they have plenty of land, and their nearest neighbor is maybe half a mile away. All of those things, contributed to how we approached the writing of our zoning text amendment, because we really wanted to get the input and make sure that we built into it as much flexibility as possible. And that did not, as we were talking about NIMBYs or people who are concerned about development, for some of them, we didn't have enough of what they considered guardrails on the type of development, but we felt it was our number one goal was to really make it much easier of a process for these projects to move forward, and to allow as much flexibility as possible. And so, like, for one example, when we talked to members of the community, one of our first drafts talked about property adjacent to a house of worship or a private education institution, because we were thinking of like a parking lot or another building that they may have. And a number of houses of worship said, we own a parking lot or own property that isn't technically adjacent to us, but might be across the street or down the street. And we want to be able to develop that. Can we write the zoning text amendment so it takes into consideration those circumstances? And so that's just one example of how working with members of the community about their unique situation and writing into our zoning text amendment as much flexibility so projects can move forward is really important.
Great. Thank you, Councilmember. Others want to chime in on lessons learned?
Yeah, I think and some of the lessons are also just cumulative lessons from various streamlining and zoning bills that we've done, and it's always like a balance. So we focus on, when we do streamlining, we tend to focus on what we call infill development, so people aren't using it in the middle of an area where there's no development, no people living there, maybe more environmentally sensitive areas. And we try to define infill fairly flexibly, so it's not too restrictive, but it does limit the amount of land. We still think a huge amount of land up and down the state is going to be covered by this law, but we want to sort of strike that balance. We also we do in this and other laws, we put some historic protections in, and I'm sensitive to that. I don't want historic landmarks to be like torn down without any kind of public review. But there are times, and I've sometimes come out on the short end of the stick on some of the debates about this in the legislature, where I feel like our exemption for historic properties is way too broad. The historic, and I say this as a former local elected official who legislated a new historic district in the central part of San Francisco. I do believe in smart historic preservation, but it can become incredibly abusive, and we have a broken process in California. And so I think it's really important not to go too broad, to be very, very laser focused on truly historic properties and not let people proclaim our whole city is a historic district, or this entire neighborhood is a historic district, even though there's really nothing historic about it in terms of how we think of historic preservation.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Peterson, I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, thank you. And I couldn't agree more, Senator Wiener. We tried to pass some legislation to kind of reduce some of those historic set-asides. I think the lesson learned, I kind of said this early on, is we had some language that kind of turned into a loophole for a lot of cities to use. So I think the lesson learned for me is we can pass state legislation or in the case of Councilmember Stewart, even countywide legislation, but that's not where the work ends. We still have to get down into the community, work with city councils, work with people in the community to make sure that they're hopefully following the spirit of the law, if not the letter of the law. And we will go back, like I said, and strengthen the letter of the law on any number of bills that deal with emergency housing and missing middle housing and the bill that I'm talking about today. So we just have to keep the work going. Sometimes we're willing to pat ourselves on the back and congratulate ourselves, and we should. I think the work done by this group of legislators has, I think I'm writing notes madly about different ideas to take to Olympia next month. But we know that the work really, and not only for us as legislators, but I think for everybody that's interested, that's going to be on, the 1,000 or so people that are on this call, to talk to your city council members, talk to your neighbors, and try to dispel some of those myths. I think that a couple of people talked about before, that no, we're not tearing down every church to build up a high rise. This is, different opportunities. So the work will never end. That's but great. That's why we're here.
Well, Representative, it reminds me of something a seminary professor said to us once in class at Howard University when we asked him, when did the work end? He said, you'll have an eternity to rest when you die. So in the meantime, keep working. So maybe in that spirit. Senator Gounardes, anything you want to mention in terms of lessons learned from your end?
Yeah, so we have not passed our bill yet, and so we are studying the lessons of other places that have done this, and we are kind of going through the growing pains and of the sausage making process right now. But two things in particular that we have found very successful. Number one is every time I talk about this, whether it's with public groups, stakeholders, or legislators, I remind everyone that faith-based institutions can already do this. It's not like we're creating a new type of developer that never existed before. Churches can already do this. Synagogues can already do this. It's just very hard for them. And there's tons and tons of examples, that we can point to of how they can already do this. So this is nothing really new. And the second thing is, as we all know, zoning changes are complicated. Development fights can get really messy and filled with lots of misinformation. And misinformation and confusion is only an opportunity for people who want to oppose us. And so I have found that simplifying the messaging, simplifying the work, dumbing it down with pictures. Like this is, on this building, this is what this could potentially look like and no more, is a way to neutralize opponents who are going to say, this is for a 50-foot tower, this is for this is for that, you're going to destroy the character of the neighborhood. But no, here's actually based on the zoning laws that we currently have and what we are proposing here, this is what this would look like. And this is not objectionable. Or do you find this objectionable? And the answer most times than not is no, I don't. And I think that has helped us kind of just smooth the way for many of these conversations on a topic that, understandably so, is just very complicated for folks who are not seeped in housing policy and in zoning policy to readily understand.
Thank you for that. And another question for whoever wants to take it. Are there any additional policies or resources that you all are focused on or thinking about to sort of take the goals of this legislation further? Because, we know the zoning allowances is one thing, and there's just a long road from having the allowable zoning to being able to actually execute on these projects. So for those who have gotten this legislation passed, are there sort of next steps or other things on your radar, either budgetary or legislative, to be able to take it further or go further for faith-based organizations?
Well, I will say one thing that, and goes beyond this particular topic to all housing, we have been starting to get increasingly focused on post-entitlement permitting. So you get your entitlement from, the planning department or whatever entity, and so you're entitled to build whatever, 50 units of this site at this height. And then you have to then go to the building department and the fire department and the Public Utilities Commission and Department of Public Works, and the list goes on. And you that can take a huge amount of time, and it can be very expensive, and you can have departments that don't coordinate well with each other. And right now, it's a purely local issue, and so we're trying to put more guardrails around that. Another one, which again goes broader than this, I don't know how things are in other states. I know that in the area I represent, and in 2/3 of California, that is the geographic territory of PG&E, which is, I think, the largest electric provider in the country, and is way too big and has sort of unraveled in a lot of ways, and is not interconnecting projects to the grid in a timely manner. And so we'll have affordable housing that gets done, gets its certificate of occupancy, or is ready to get a certificate of occupancy, and PG&E says, okay, we'll connect you to the grid in 15 months. And it's not just housing, and do it for a homeless shelter or for a new business trying to open, and it's so unacceptable. And I suspect that this is an issue in other places. PG&E might be one of the worst offenders, but it's a growing problem that we need to grapple with.
I wanted to jump in on something Representative Peterson talked about before, and really talk about the role of enterprise and what you all have been doing in communities, because I think that is vital. One of the things that we have found with some of the projects that are gearing up, or projects that moved forward before and going through the arduous process we had, is many of these projects are starting with community members, with the congregations and their neighbors. Sometimes they're lucky and they have somebody in that congregation who might know the planning process. They may have a land use attorney. More often than not, they do not. And so, as was said before, writing zoning text amendments, zoning law, and all this land use is really technical issues. And so having expertise, even for those of us who have passed legislation to make it easier, is really important. For the congregations that are looking at moving this forward. And also the support in thinking about the process you go through. We've all talked here today about folks who may oppose a project. And I've seen some of the best projects that move forward are ones that really start engaging with their neighbors very early on in these processes. And so providing that support as well, and expertise on how to reach out to, and community engagement, and keeping people in the community in the loop on how a project is developing is really important. And, I know we're really lucky here in Montgomery County that Enterprise is working with a cohort of our houses of worship. But I hope that we can continue that going. And I'd love to see that be able to be multiplied, because I think it's that hands-on, that technical assistance, and that support for members of our community that are going to help these projects move forward now that we've made the zoning a bit easier for them.
I want to build on that question that Patrick asked, and this is to all, and it's really a combination of what's the next, what's the 2.0, but also loop it back to the kind of the case making and the potential impact, right? And so the notion of, again, when you talk about in the county 500 plus properties, or 0.75 to 1% in New York. I know the Terner Center, who we'll be hearing from later in California, did an analysis, right, of what the potential was. I remember being at a presentation in Denver years ago, and there was a conversation with philanthropy and some local government housing officials. And when somebody talked about what the potential number of units were that could come online with the faith community, one of a local housing official said, wow, well, if that happens, we're going to have to devote a whole lot more money to affordable housing. It was like, we just had a breakthrough in group, right? Like, exactly. So I'm curious for you all, if you've had any of that experience where, as you start to kind of make the case around how much potential there is in terms of what could be built on land owned by houses of worship around affordable housing or community center facilities, does that help inform other legislative moves, right, in general, for more resources for affordable housing when people start, or for better permitting, as Senator Wiener was talking about, or more streamlined permitting, because you say, look, we could potentially create a real robust pipeline if we're intentional here. Any thoughts on that?
Oh,
Go ahead, Scott.
Oh, thanks. No, I absolutely. I mean, we've really profoundly strengthened our housing planning requirements for cities. They have much higher numerical goals to meet, which has caused a lot of healthy tension, and they have to have what we call a housing element, which has to be compliant, but they lose a lot of state funding. And so it requires a significant amount of below market rate housing in addition to the market rate housing. And so the cities are very understandably coming to us and saying, okay, help us. I mean, there are cities that pass local affordable housing bonds or other revenue streams. We have our last governor, Jerry Brown, who was fantastic in so many ways, but he did not believe in subsidizing housing, just philosophically was opposed. Governor Newsom is much more supportive. And so we have really increased state support for affordable housing in the last 6 years, but we need to do a lot more. And my colleague, Assemblymember Buffy Wicks from the East Bay, another amazing housing champion, has been pushing for a few years now to do a huge state housing bond.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Gounardes?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen, we saw that dynamic play out with our New York City Council, which I said earlier is voting today on its City of Yes proposal. As part of the negotiations for that, there's going to be a $5 billion increase in expenditures to help support the construction of a lot of the housing that the zoning changes are going to allow for. And that's going to help with some of the infrastructure needs, as well as more of the subsidized housing. And the state is going to be putting $1 billion in towards that pot. And so I think, there's been this realization that it's not just about the regulation, because you need more than that. You got to address the financing question. You have to address the infrastructure question. You have to address all these things. But once you kind of get people to the table and say, okay, we're down to build more housing, then I think it just becomes a question of dollars and cents and how much governments are willing to put into it if they have the leadership that believes in supporting that type of investment, which I think we're seeing in New York. Our governor, the last 2 years, has created a program to give incentives to jurisdictions, to municipalities that meet certain benchmarks. A number of jurisdictions have started to change some of their zoning laws to meet some of those benchmarks. They're chasing that that distinction of being a pro-housing community now, and so we are seeing things loosen up a little bit in a positive way. Nowhere near where we need to be, of course, but again, we are seeing things shift in that direction.
That's great. Representative Peterson, I'm curious, from your perch leading the housing committee there, if you've seen any influence or impact around the thought of what this pipeline could be in terms of more general support for affordable housing development there in the state.
Yeah, I mean, I think at its core, it's building coalitions, right, to make sure that people understand that is whether it's a faith community that's doing outreach or whoever, that these are our friends and neighbors that we're housing. These aren't strangers. These are people that are close to us. So that's incredibly helpful, because like, for example, the passage of this bill a few years ago was overwhelmingly bipartisan. Not all housing bills have been. We've been pretty fortunate on the supply side here in Washington to pass some pretty bipartisan work. But I did want to touch base on kind of the earlier kind of what are some of the other issues that are coming up in other legislation or funding. Really, the cost of operation, especially when we're dealing with permanent supportive housing or housing for those people that are really in need. I know we are certainly not unique in seeing extravagant insurance rate increases for things like permanent supportive housing, where we're seeing workforce issues for whether it's, people to work, whether it's therapists or, case managers, whatever, to work in some of these types of housing. We have huge shortage in Washington State. I think it's nationwide in, some of these professions. So building it is one thing, and that's critical, but making sure that we can support the activities that go on, especially, I think it's, as Senator Wiener pointed out, that kind of 30% and below AMI, where, these families and these individuals are going to need support, and we need to make sure that we can properly fund the people that are doing, well, here we are doing God's work with a lot of these communities. So that's one of the other things that we have to make sure that we're taking into account, as well as, and somebody pointed out, the infrastructure. We just started a recent program in our capital budget to help kind of that last mile infrastructure. So if somebody has a project, but boy, they need a new sewer line or a new water line, we do have some capital budget dollars that can help fund that. So that helps that bottom line do the work.
That's great. Thank you, Representative. Yeah, Councilmember Stewart.
I was going to add too, one of the things that on the affordability piece that we had a lot of discussion with is making sure that we're not just talking about rental, but home ownership opportunities in this. And I think during our conversation of when we were passing our zoning text amendment, that was a really important piece of this, and is also an important piece for some of the houses of worship that are looking at this, because we're also, again, as we're looking to advance our racial equity work, when we look at the disparities in home ownership between white community members and those who are Black and brown, we're looking at how do we close that gap. And, I think that is also a really important piece of this conversation, because lots of times when we talk about affordability, I think the default in many people's minds is to think about rental homes. And we really need to make sure that we are including opportunities for home ownership as well.
Councilmember, appreciate you saying that. And it's interesting. We've had one of the several cohort members around the country who have started to think about ownership. Typically congregations want to maintain ownership or control of the land over the long term, generally, not always, but generally. But that notion of what are some models where they can do that and still support wealth building, right? And we've got a group, for example, down in South Florida that's been very explicit about, hey, we want to help build wealth in Black communities, for example, the Collective Empowerment Group, and what are models there. We've got about 3 minutes left. I want to do kind of a final question and maybe ask folks to take maybe 30 seconds to hit this, which is for those who are when you think about current legislation that's in places like New York, or maybe 2.0, or even the implementation of things that have been passed, is there any suggestion you would have to the faith community and or to the development community on the role that they can play to help either get legislation enacted and or implemented from where you sit? So any thoughts there, Senator Wiener? Maybe we'll start left coast and come right. So we'll go California, Washington, New York, and then end in Montgomery County. How about that?
I will tell you, and I assume that my colleagues will agree wholeheartedly, that one of the best things when you're authoring a tough bill is when you have people in every community who are like going up to your legislative colleagues at community events or in the supermarket saying, hey, there's this bill and you have to vote for it. And this was one of those bills. We had this massive faith coalition of various faiths up and down the state. I mean, just these people who are just core, like, leaders in their community and are so active in their local congregations and in local, just community work. And when I would talk to my colleagues about the bill, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, I'm good on that. They've been coming up to me at church or in the supermarket," and so having that massive grassroots uprising is really, really powerful. And this is one of those bills. It gets people really, really excited.
Right. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Senator. Representative Peterson?
Great. And yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think the other one, maybe a little more kind of internally or, wonky in the halls of wherever we work, or creating alliances that aren't always natural. So when we passed a lot of the supply work, including a bill, the Covenant Home Ownership Act, which was perhaps my favorite housing bill. I could go on and on about that one. But, we had a coalition of labor, of realtors, of builders, of environmentalists, of housing advocates really come together to pass a suite of bills. We had huge disagreements on other bills around housing, on rent stabilization and some of the other things like that. But so often we just think, oh, our labor partners and the builders are just not going to get along. Every once in a while, you find that lightning in a bottle, and you've got to take advantage of it. And I think, kind of to Senator Wiener's point, then they also help talk to all of the other legislators and talk to people in their community, and then know that that coalition's not going to always stick together with other issues, and that's okay.
Yep, that's great. Thank you, sir. Senator Gounardes?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo both of my colleagues' comments here. And, as legislators, we're often sensitive to when, if there's a vocal, organized group in our districts, no matter the size, if they're vocal, you're going to pay attention. And so when opponents to housing, who are always going to be organized, start, coming at you and emailing you and calling you, you're going to get a little skittish. And the way to overcome that is to have more people on the other side say, actually, no, we want housing. And so, I think it's really helpful for faith communities to activate their congregants, their members, not only the clergy, but their members. Your members are going to benefit from this housing. Call your state senator, call your state assembly member, write them a letter, send them a tweet, do whatever you got to do. Tell them that you support these efforts, that they're not just hearing from the small, organized, vocal minority, but they are hearing from the silent majority of people who want us to take action to solve the housing crisis.
That's great. Thank you. Councilmember Stewart, we'll let you back clean up for us here.
Great. I'm glad to. So just thank you so much. I agree with what everyone said. I think it's really important and important to centering the people that we're, the folks we're working with in the community and the people we want to live here. And the fact that we are in a crisis and the option to do nothing is not on the table. And so I would also say, in agreement with all my colleagues, that as we're bringing people together, as we're talking to the members of the faith community and the development community, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Like, we may not get everything we want in the very first iteration of a bill or a ZTA, but we are in a housing crisis, and we need to do more than we're doing right now.
Councilmember Stewart, the option to do nothing is not on the table. I think we may put that on a T-shirt, and that's a great word to end on. I want to thank my co-moderator, Patrick Boyle, and again, I want to thank Representatives from Peterson, Senator Scott Wiener, Councilmember Kate Stewart, and Senator Andrew Gounardes for being with us today. Really appreciate your time, and more importantly, appreciate the work you all are doing across the country and your willingness to continue at it. So we'll look forward to continue work with you all. So thank you all for joining us today. As you all have heard, this work that we're doing is really critical. And one of the encouraging signs is that in this ecosystem, the movement is growing. There's a growing recognition that you've heard by elected officials, government agencies, philanthropy, developers, and the faith community itself, that the faith community is well poised to be solution partners in the work to address the nation's affordable housing challenge. Cities like Charlotte, North Carolina, and Nashville, Tennessee are some of the latest working to direct resources to support faith-based development efforts in their cities. The Yes in God's Backyard Act that was introduced in 2024 at the federal level by United States Senator Sherrod Brown, if enacted, that legislation would have provided technical assistance and grants to support faith-based development. There are more professionals who are entering this field that are doing a range of work, from what I would like to refer to as step zero discernment work, to capacity building and technical assistance, to putting together financing tools targeted to support faith-based development. We really are seeing a growth in the professionalization, if you would, of the industry that we refer to around faith-based development. At Enterprise, as you heard our CEO say earlier, we're operating multi-year cohorts working with nearly 150 houses of worship in 11 cities and 6 states and the District of Columbia. These cohort members and their development partners are projected to build 9,000 new affordable homes in the coming years. We're also excited about that collaboration that Sean referenced with the Church of God in Christ, and we're going to have one of their representatives on our panel coming up here momentarily. And in 2025, we expect new efforts to launch through Enterprise cohorts in Ohio and California. And as new stakeholders and professionals enter this field, and as elected officials expand their support, we could really see increasing positive impact in communities at the intersection of faith, mission, and money. Now, to further discuss this and what we heard from our first panel, we will now hear from our stakeholder response panel on the theme on-the-ground impact of policy efforts supporting faith-based development. So I'm pleased to be joined today by my co-moderator for this panel, Jess Blanche. Jess is a senior program director with our Pacific Northwest office and helps lead our FBDI efforts in the Seattle region. And our panelists who will be joining Jess and I today for this conversation include Mohammed Alameldin, a policy associate with the Terner Center for Housing Innovation at the UC Berkeley, Reverend Will Green, pastor, Silver Spring United Methodist Church in Silver Spring, Maryland, Bishop R.C. Hugh Nelson, who's the pastor of the Ebenezer Urban Ministry Center in New York City, Roberta Scher, who's a senior housing developer with Beacon Development Group doing work out in Washington State, and Derek Scott, who is the chair of the Church of God in Christ Faith-Based Development Initiative Committee. Want to thank all of you all for joining with us today. We're going to bring Derek onto our panel side. And so I'm pleased to turn it over to my colleague, Jess, to kick us off. Jess, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, David. Roberta, from your perspective as a developer in Washington State, what impacts have you seen from the legislation passed in Washington and at the local level where local jurisdictions have provided policy implementation?
Great, thanks, Jess. So I would say that the Seattle area is not new with churches doing development. We've seen that happening before the passage of the legislation, but we have seen a significant uptick since the passage of legislation in churches and other faith-based organizations really looking to be a part of the solution to this problem. Particularly along the I-5 corridor, I see this most pronounced. We are working with 2 churches in Tacoma, for example, that are putting up housing on land that they own. One is doing 60 units of housing for families. The other is doing 63 units of housing for seniors. There's a church in Seattle that is doing a very large several phase development that will produce several hundred units of housing. There are also some churches north of Seattle, and we get calls on a regular basis from churches saying, I'm sitting on land that I need to, that I want to use, or there's property next to my church that I would like to purchase to be able to put new housing on. I just went to see a site a couple of weeks ago. A church is sitting next to 2.5 acres of land that they want to purchase to be able to put up housing and community facilities for the neighborhood. So it's been pretty remarkable, the change and what this has opened up for various religious organizations across the state.
Roberta, thanks for that. Mohammed, want to move to you and thank you for joining us. We heard about the legislation that was enacted in California from Senator Wiener, and it certainly has received a good deal of national attention. We know that the Terner Center has done some great research on the amount of land owned by houses of worship and faith institutions. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what type of potential there is for development of affordable housing on faith-based owned land in the state of California, and how that compares even to the number of new affordable housing units that are needed in the state. Again, in the context of kind of the case-making work, you all have done great work there.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for having me. When it comes to SB4 that Senator Wiener introduced, this was his fourth time a bill like this was introduced in the state of California, and it finally passed about last year. This paper came out while the bill was being discussed, and people were like, what's the data? How much land could we build? How much housing could we build on the land available? And so the bill initially is for faith-based lands and nonprofit colleges. And just for those 2 factors, like those 2 criteria, we found that it was about 5 times the size of Oakland, right? So to perspective, like over 100,000 acres. For faith-based organizations themselves, we found the total to be about 47,000 acres of land that we could build affordable housing on. And the way that we did the data is that the minimum lot size that was eligible for our study was about 10,000 square feet. So it doesn't even account for parcels of land that are smaller than 10,000 square feet. The reason why we use the 10,000 square foot threshold is because when you do a light tech development, they kind of want a bigger plot of land so they could build more units. But there's also a lot of potential to build that affordable housing on smaller plots of land. Half of the land that we found is in high opportunity areas. So in California, we have opportunity mapping for affordable housing to reach our affirmatively furthering fair housing goals, which really just means reversing segregation. And about half of them are in historically exclusionary areas. So you get to build more housing in places that didn't allow housing for a long time, especially multifamily housing. 13% of the land is near high quality transit. At the time, that's about intervals of every 15 minutes, a bus or a train were to come through. And a lot of this land is in single family zones. And through the bill, you could build additional stories higher than what was allowed in a single family zone, but allows for multifamily housing to be in single family areas. What this means for affordable housing within the state of California is, number one, we found a solution. We streamlined basically this process across the state. We standardized it across the state. Instead of every local government doing a different thing, pastor in San Diego could call a mosque in the Bay Area and they have the same exact set of rules. And it's about 1 acre per unhoused person, according to our state PIT counts. PIT counts aren't the best factor of how many unhoused people there are in an area, but that's just kind of to give it a perspective. And now what California is facing is we can ministerially approve all we want, but now we need money and technical assistance for us to actually solve this problem, right? Zoning is what is possible, but it's up to us to make it happen.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks, Mohammed. And 47,000 acres it's a lot of land, right? When you talk about the potential to build there, so appreciate that. Pastor Willett Green, we want to come to you. We heard in the last panel, Councilmember Kate Stewart talked about, and the other panelists, the importance of the engagement of community and the engagement of the faith community. Talk a little bit about the role that you and other houses of worship played in providing input to the council member and the council around the legislation that recently passed Montgomery County, and your thoughts on the new policy and what it may potentially, how it may encourage houses of worship to consider doing affordable housing development on their land.
Absolutely, and thank you again for having me. So a little bit of background. In the fall of 2022, our congregation, Silver Spring United Methodist Church, was an intentional visioning discussion around a feasibility study for housing development that we had received. And as a part of that, we were really clear that it was important to begin to engage community stakeholders who were with us, a part of the building of beloved community we do here every day on our corner. And that included everybody from our scouting troops to local nonprofits to county and state leaders. And as we began that conversation, we were really clear that we wanted to build a coalition of people to have a conversation, not just about our project, but the way that it might inspire exponential housing development by other houses of worship. And how we might facilitate that as long as we were values aligned. And for us, those values really centered on making practical reparations for the ways that we had benefited from and participated in the historically racist zoning policies and practices here in Montgomery County. Recognizing, for instance, that one of the very first developers to use redlining policies in their deeds was a founding member of our own congregation. And so as we began that conversation, we happened to realize that one of our scout leaders was a high-level member of the planning board here in Montgomery County. We sat down with him. He was values aligned with us and pointed out a conditional use exemption in the code already on the books that allowed for senior-only affordable housing development. And he planted a seed. He said, it doesn't make much sense that it's just for senior-only housing. I wonder if there's a way we might address that. So with that in mind, we then reached out to Councilmember Stewart and the county executive. We invited them here to our campus to begin to have a conversation. Councilmember Stewart, now Council President Stewart, indicated that she had some interest. And so we pulled together a group of 23 faith leaders representing 6 different faith traditions and 7 different denominations to have a conversation about what the values we would want to see reflected in a zoning text amendment would look like. And that initial conversation produced a document that we provided to Councilmember Stewart and her staff that really launched the building of that coalition that came around that zoning text amendment and worked together to help get it passed here in the county. I think as we look at the long-term impact of that, I'm excited to say that our congregation will be the first or one of the first to use that zoning text amendment to build 123 units of rental housing and 12 affordable for purchase townhomes here on our campus in downtown Silver Spring. We are partnering with Enterprise, so it's especially exciting to be here today, in the development of those units. And I'm mindful of at least 3 other faith-based organizations right now that we are actively partnering with and mentoring through conversations to use that zoning text amendment. But the other thing that I think is important to note here is that this is a faithful first step, but it's not the final step. And I think that's true in any kind of legislative conversation that you're having, right? It doesn't accomplish everything we hoped for. The green space requirements and height restrictions that it includes actually preclude congregations, many of whom are in downtown areas or in rural areas, from achieving the density that they would otherwise be able to achieve. And so we know that it began a conversation that's going to need to continue as we move forward.
Pastor Green, thanks for that. And I know Jess has got a question coming up. I'll just flag for folks. One, we'll get a little more into kind of what folks think should be next. And so I'm glad you put a kind of pin on that. And also to note, Councilmember Stewart noted that we have a cohort that Enterprise is helping run in collaboration with investment by Montgomery County to support 7 congregations who are looking to do development. So it's interesting that the county has invested dollars for technical support and some early pre-development expenses, and the legislative fix that's coming as well. So there's that kind of 1-2 punch. Jess, I'll turn over to you for our next question.
Yeah, thank you. Bishop Nelson with Ebenezer Urban Ministry Center in New York City. I understand your development required some zoning changes. What political support and capital was crucial to your success and rezoning?
Thank you, David and Jess, and of course, to the Enterprise family. I'm really privileged for this opportunity. We actually stumbled into the housing industry. Our congregation has been in Brooklyn now for over 50 years, and we were looking for larger facilities, basically to build a larger sanctuary. And so by faith, we actually took a step of faith and purchased 2 city blocks, which were somewhat impoverished. They were like chop shops. And we purchased those 2 city blocks by faith with the hope of building a larger sanctuary and to expand our operation. Somewhere in the process, I felt God laying upon my heart that we should not be building only for the church, but instead should build to meet a need in the community. And we started exploring. And of course, Eric Adams, who's now the mayor, was the borough president of Brooklyn. And it was at the same time they were bringing clergy, bankers, developers together in a conversation as to how we could address the housing crisis in New York. And so it just so happened that we were on paper the owners of these 2 city blocks, which were occupied by 22 tenants, basically chop shops, car detailing. And so Eric came along, supported us, and we purchased the property for $8.1 million. However, we recognized that it was zoned for manufacturing, R7D, R7A, and which meant we could build a church, but we couldn't build for housing. And so I spoke to several of the politicians, and to be very candid, none supported the notion of rezoning. And but as a pastor, we preach faith. We try to practice faith. So I told my political representatives, I said, I have a partner you cannot see. I was inferring, of course, to the Holy Spirit. And so we met with the city council, the community board, and we started to dialogue as to what this partnership could mean and how, by rezoning, we could actually transform that area of the community. Spoke to several different politicians. We also went to housing. Eventually, with all the pushback, we still kept moving step by step and ultimately received that miraculous correspondence. Congratulations, the property is now rezoned. So it was a long process, but as I remind pastors, our main mission is to uplift the community. The building is merely a vehicle. And so with that kind of approval, we were able to go into partnership with 3 developers and to build out a ministry space of 40,000 square footage and 530 apartments above, affordable apartments. And as our representative said in the earlier panel, folks are finding it impossible to remain in New York City. And they need to know that there's a pathway that housing can be provided where they can stay in the location that we were born and grew up, and that we as together could really develop a beautiful city. So in spite of the pushback at first, we were successful with rezoning. And on Monday, actually, we'll be having a delegation from Enterprise to walk the grounds and to see what Ebenezer Urban Ministry looks like.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. And what is the most important thing for other faith-based organizations in a similar situation that might contribute to their success?
I love talking to pastors and actually have introduced them to Enterprise. The key thing was I felt God had given me a vision that would elevate the welfare. And regardless of what appeared to be obstacles, I stayed with the vision. And I believe that if God gives you a vision, he will make provision. And in this partnership with Enterprise and faith-based organizations, I think the timing is right. And regardless of our political persuasions, when I got to a place where I felt somewhat discouraged and almost walked away from the project, I was talking to a pastor and talking about the difficulties of trying to engage in this space. He made one statement I'll never forget. He said, "Nelson, God is not building any more dirt." So the fact remains, work with what you have. And that was a pivotal reminder. Stay focused and recognize that regardless of the pushbacks at times, there will be individuals of conscience with a moral compass who recognize we need to act on behalf of those who do not have power.
Bishop Nelson, appreciate you saying that. In the notion of provision, right? And this like some might hear this conversation, well, I thought this was a panel about policy. It's like, right, the provision you may need is the zoning change so that God's provision can come in a land use change, right? And so folks have to connect the dots. That provision may mean money, it may mean brain power, it may mean a policy change. And so being really clear on that. By the way, I want to say that on our first panel, Councilmember Stewart got the T-shirt of the day award when she said the option to do nothing is not on the table. Bishop Nelson, you get the T-shirt, put it on a T-shirt award for our second panel when you said I have a partner you cannot see. That will absolutely be going on a T-shirt. So, Derek Scott, you are moving in this realm as well. You, in your day job, you wear the hat of a developer. You also serve within the national denomination as the chairman of the Church of God in Christ Faith-Based Development Initiative Committee. And as the denomination is moving forward towards supporting faith-based development cohorts across the country, when thinking about policy changes that have taken place and those that are being considered, what are some of the specific provisions that you believe will be particularly helpful to houses of worship looking to develop housing and/or community facilities on their land?
Thanks, David, and thanks for having us here on the panel. It's certainly a great opportunity to be here with some great folks. as you said, the Church of God in Christ, we've embarked on this great endeavor. Sean Donovan mentioned earlier that one of our goals is to develop more than 18,000 new units of housing across our houses of worship across the country. And, one of our goals as a denomination is to increase the number of homeowners and build wealth among congregants. And so certainly policies that affect that are things that are very important to us. And I believe Councilwoman Stewart did a good job of kind of hitting on that home ownership piece earlier. But I think some of the policies that we are looking at and some of the more specific things, both on the state and federal level, is, the expansion of down payment assistance programs for first-time home buyers, especially people of color, thinking through the expansion of those programs and ensuring that they stay in place. While there's some threats across certain states and both federally to make some of those programs go away. And then also taking steps to ensure we've all been in this high mortgage rate environment. Folks are just not buying houses in a high mortgage rate environment. Can we incentivize policy that, again, starts to drive down mortgage rates, keep rates low, and incentivize people to take out a mortgage, buy a home, and see it as a viable option and a viable path. And then, one of the larger challenges, especially as we look at federal loan products, is, reducing or eliminating mortgage insurance premium costs, which are continuing to go up. And the threat of, those mortgage insurance premium costs continuing to make it difficult, sometimes to qualify for a mortgage in certain neighborhoods and certain communities where people want to live. We often say that there's not necessarily an affordable housing problem in many communities. There's an affordable housing crisis in communities of choice where people actually want to live. You can go into some neighborhoods and find housing, but it's not necessarily the place where our families want to raise children or raise their family or want to be. And so how do we ensure that people aren't being displaced and that policies are affecting the ability for people to buy into neighborhoods of choice, where they live and where they want to live. And so I think one of these other goals for us as we deliver on our multifamily strategy for affordable housing is, you heard Sean Donovan say earlier that, one of our goals is ambitiously 18,000 units, 70 plus community facilities across these first 200 churches that we intend to take through training. And so I think some of the things that are important to that is going back and doubling down on the land use policies that were mentioned earlier to allow for zoning to be a little bit more straightforward. And I think I'll use California as an example since it was highlighted earlier with SB4. While it's a great legislative tool to allow houses of worship by right to start to remove some of the regulatory tape, there are still local municipalities that don't know what that looks like. They don't know what it means. They don't know how to interpret it with their local zoning code. And so I think, one, being very intentional with working with local municipalities to understand and interpret some of these policies that are coming down. How do we, simplify some of the language where some of these planning departments only have 1 or 2 staff members, and some of the cities where our congregations are working in, they don't have people that can interpret these large codes and language. So, what are some of the things that we can do to make policy more accessible for some of the places that our congregants and congregations are trying to do work? And then protecting these tax credit programs. We have, LIHTC, we have historic tax credits, new markets, rehabilitation tax credit program. I think those are important to continue to not only protect, but expand those programs. We know that in most states, our LIHTC is very competitive, the 4% and the 9% in certain states. And so developers that have been doing this for many, many years sort of have the game on lock when it comes to, pursuing tax credits. How do we ensure that our houses of worship, as they're stepping into sort of the game of doing tax credit development, are as competitive? And I don't think we should be pitting churches or houses of worship against developers. I think we should be intentional with policy that starts to do set asides and carve outs for faith-based entities, where we're increasing both the allocation of tax credits in those states, but then also having set asides for faith-based organizations. Again, I think Mohammed did a great job of outlaying the quantity of houses of worship that own land, control land, and have the ability to do development. And I think that warrants the opportunity to say we should be intentional about having set asides and carve outs for a lot of these federal programs that can do that. So for us, I think there are a lot more federal policies and initiatives that we certainly want to push on. There are changes that are certainly coming at HUD and other regulatory agencies, federal agencies. And our goal is to keep our, kind of finger on the pulse of those to ensure that there are still tools and policies that are provided to advance the work that we're trying to do.
Derek, thanks for that. I'll turn over to thanks, Derek. Jess?
Thanks, David. So this is a question for all of you. What do you see as missing in the federal, state, local policy ecosystem that you'd like to see enacted to further support houses of worship looking to develop affordable housing and or community serving facilities? And then also what's missing in the funding and finance ecosystem? Bishop Nelson?
Thank you. At least I'm speaking from my location in Brooklyn, especially in dense populations where there's so many historical restrictions. The requirements of even building and based on the size of your congregation, you talk about parking. In a place like New York City, if you were going to find parking or adequate parking, you'll never build. So especially having access to the regular transportation, whether the train, the bus, exceptions need to be made. And many times there is not the political goodwill to make these adjustments to facilitate, especially our Black-brown communities. We're located in Brownsville community, which is a historically impoverished community. So when you look at the scale, the life scale, whether it be health, education, or home ownership, Brownsville majors in the lower levels, high crime, low home ownership. And so there needs to be some accommodation if we're going to facilitate real economic development of our impoverished communities.
Pastor Green, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there are two answers to this question in my mind. And one is that there needs to be greater funding and support to address the generational and racial wealth gaps that exist through providing housing opportunities, providing for, even in the LIHTC program, hopefully at some point, affordable for purchase options and funding that helps construct those, I think is going to be critical. There are currently some ways that you can do that in a rent to own kind of model, but as we all know, those can be very predatory models that ultimately wind up hurting rather than helping families that are living in those units. And so, especially here in Montgomery County, where the racial wealth gap is about $156,000 on average, and that's at the high end of things. That's high on my mind. And then secondary, not necessarily related to our local, state, and federal governments, but to our adjudicatory policies and practices. I'm looking at Brother Derek and giving thanks for the work that the Church of God in Christ is doing and wondering how the United Methodist Church can begin to do the same thing. The Pew Institute indicates that in the next 10 years, up to 50% of our houses of worship could close. That's billions of dollars worth of property that we have received in legacy from past generations. And so there's this question in my mind, how are we doing the legacy planning that's going to be required to ensure that that property continues to help build beloved community and do that in a way that continues to resource our communities in the ways that our houses of worship have in years prior.
Right. Roberta?
Yeah, I would just like to add to what's already been said. I think we need more funding options besides the LIHTC program. We've put most of our eggs in the LIHTC basket. And as somebody said earlier, it's very competitive. And I think it's also very cumbersome in terms of a lot of compliance. And I think if we had other funding resources that perhaps were less cumbersome, and that enables folks to do smaller developments. It would also make that much easier for churches to move into this space with smaller developments. I know of a church that's doing very small development, but they were having a hard time coming up with resources because you either have LIHTC or nothing, and they don't fit into either one of those boxes. So I think that would be really important. I think also technical assistance to help provide additional technical assistance money to churches so that they can put their own policies and processes in place so that they can be a stronger developer, whether or not they're doing it by themselves or partnering with somebody else. I think that what we're seeing is that, there's a lot of their own house they have to get in order before they're really ready to move forward. And so that would really, I think, be very helpful to them.
Derek?
Yeah, Roberta took it right out of my mouth, so I'll double down with Roberta, and put some context around technical assistance. We're trying to train 200 houses of worship and then provide them $100,000 of grant assistance to do feasibility study, pre-development work to see if they actually have a, development that they can move forward with and the tools to do that. That's $20 million just to grant, and then another, $6 million just to run the program. That's $26 million. And while that, is a heavy lift, we have another 1,800 congregations that own a total of 48,000 acres of land that can be put to use that we don't have a pathway to raise funding to provide technical assistance for them. And so I think if there was an opportunity, right, for pipelining technical assistance dollars that ultimately is going to leverage more capital coming into communities, this is capital that is being invested with developer partners, owners representatives that are working in these communities. And for us, primarily Black and brown developers and development partners that we can reinvest back into our own communities and build a wealth ecosystem with. And so I think having more programs where we have technical assistance being provided and then capital that we can reinvest back into our communities, I think that's important. And then secondly, I just want to double down on the home ownership, component and incentive that one of the largest sort of pieces of policy that we're missing is to really drive and incentivize home ownership. I don't think anybody's telling us not to do home ownership, but there's certainly not an incentive in certain environments to do home buying programs. And so when you think about the amount that it costs to bring online a LIHTC unit, the average cost I saw last year was about $550,000 a unit across the country or somewhere in the likes. And where I live, you can build a single family home, 2,700 square feet, for about $350,000. And it just doesn't make sense that we're continuing to invest dollars or recycle dollars into this affordable housing issue that continues to grow, but not supporting the home ownership issue. So I think it's not one or the other. I think it's both and I think we can do better with really pushing, whether it's tax abatements, tax incentives that also incorporate and incentivize that. And then I'll leave with the example of Michigan, who I think has done a good job with this. They have a program, a TIF program, tax increment financing program, tax reimbursement that used to only incentivize through brownfield redevelopment of multifamily or mixed-use development. Well, then now through the State Housing Development Authority, MISHDA, there's now a MISHDA housing TIF that also includes single-family homes, which now incentivizes TIF reimbursements on single-family homes. And I think that's a game changer to start to incentivize that. And I think that's a model that other states can start to follow as well.
Derek, appreciate it. Mohammed, I want to come to right before we go to you, Mohammed. I just want to echo or build on something Derek said about in this conversation about policy, a lot of it has tended to lean towards land use, which is important and critical, period, next sentence. That being said, there's also policy in terms of how state or local governments make investments of dollars. And I think Derek just alluded to Michigan. We know in our ecosystem that, for example, Montgomery County, Maryland, Prince George's County, Maryland, Washington, D.C. have put local dollars in to support multi-year cohorts. The city of Charlotte, North Carolina has an RFP on the street now that will provide dollars for the kind of TA cohort backboning. Alameda County, California, several years ago, put dollars on the street for that. So it is this notion, Roberta and Derek talking about the importance of the technical assistance and support that those who are listening and hear this, right, may think about how to encourage state governments and particularly local governments to put dollars on the line for that TA and capacity building. Mohammed, I saw you come off mute. We'll go to you.
Yeah, definitely. Working through the federal, state, and local policy ecosystems, right? When it comes to the federal government, right, the federal government doesn't really control land use, they control funding. There has been an increase in funding when it comes to affordable housing for like the last, 20 years, 30 years? And hard costs have been going up about 10% per year. Soft costs have been going up too. So there is this lack of investment that's going on at the federal level. We need more than the LIHTC program, definitely. There's different ways of which we could fund and build affordable housing. And it's really up to states right now, right? Like California always tries to put some money into affordable housing each year, even though it isn't a permanent part of its budget. And I know SB4 is a little more complicated than a lot of states would see when it comes to like state legislation, but it's a standardized system. And other states could pass a standardized system across the state. So it gets just a lot easier when it comes to giving that technical assistance. So you don't have like 6 or 7 counties all trying to provide technical assistance at the same time. Someone could do it at a statewide level. So I really do think standardizing things at the state level, I don't think any state will have a more complicated bill than SB4 outside of maybe New York. But like when it comes to other states, you're going to have a much more simplified. You're going to have clear timelines when it comes to your permits, your post entitlements, et cetera. There's a lot more that could be grown out of the California model, right? And when it comes to local governments and state governments, they could also, there's technical assistance. That's definitely important. We also, I think, need like sort of a vetting system of which affordable housing developers you could really trust when it comes to working with your land and right, because land is a very valuable resource. They're not building more dirt. I was giving a talk on SB4 in a Buddhist monastery in LA, and a Catholic priest came to me and he says, we worked with a developer and they took all our land. And I was like, and this was before SB4, and I was like, wow, we kind of need a vetting system, a third-party vetting system to make sure that these are resources that local worship centers could trust. So yeah, a standardization, more funding, more resources. I echo everyone here, but I also think a vetting system just so people could trust who they work with is very important here.
I saw a lot of nodding heads with amen on that one, Mohammed. So that's a great idea. Last one, the vetting system. Let me ask a question. We got about 10 minutes left here. I want to ask a question to the entire group. We heard some conversation from our elected officials about the importance of faith community being involved and how to get involved. And so I was curious to hear from any of you all about how you've seen the faith community get involved in the development and or passage of policies. And Pastor Green, you talked about this a little bit earlier, how you've seen the faith community get involved and what more you think the faith community could be doing at local levels, state levels, national levels, right, to push for policies that may support development of affordable housing community facilities by faith community. And I want to put a little fine point on this. How faith community can lean in with elected officials, number one, but also policy in the boardrooms, right? Kind of in the private sector. So be curious your thoughts on either front. Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, there's several thoughts. This is such a rich conversation. I always say I got into this space accidentally. So I was thinking of a local church and then recognized this is a much larger space. And I've actually committed myself. Now, Derek is doing something for the Church of God in Christ. I'm with the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee. So the, Ebenezer Plaza is the first model in our denomination. And so I'm encouraging other pastors, especially in urban settings, to, as a matter of fact, just sitting during this meeting, one pastor in Florida that I introduced to Enterprise, another one in Tennessee. These are pastors I am not, because the truth is we went to seminary. we were taught how to run a church, not how to develop a city, not how to become involved in development. And so when we started Ebenezer Plaza, I actually went back to school, went back to Fordham University, just to learn to navigate the space. So I've been actively encouraging other pastors in my denomination to do some work, become familiar with the work of Enterprise. So I've been pushing the mission of Enterprise unofficially, because the support from Enterprise has been key for us. And of course, New York is a very complicated place. There's so many regulations and so many contending waves. And so navigating these waves and finding partnerships is so important. But Mohammed, you're perfectly right. And I've also run into pastors who ventured somewhat out in some development without doing due diligence, without vetting properly, and they were taken advantage of. And with true transparency, the owners who sold us the two city blocks did not intend to release it to us. Now, I just want it to be out there. What they were hoping was that after we purchased, that we would have somewhat have difficulty completing the deal, and then by default, they would have still had their hands in the project. But there's a partner we have that no one can see. And so when we paid down from $8 to $5 million and couldn't get a bank to finance the $5 million. So when we went into the development phase with our development partners, we were not able to generate the funds. So when we pay them off the outstanding $5 million, they were incensed. They were like, no, you didn't tell us you were going to do development. You said you were going to build for your church. I said, well, are we the owners? We don't have to tell you what we plan to do. So in reality, God had to literally guide the process. So we don't take credit for Ebenezer. We ventured into these waters. So I'm encouraging pastors in our denomination, even outside of the country, who are pastoring in urban settings, to look at the model of Ebenezer. And so, Derek, I want to follow up with you because I would love to see our denomination take that commitment. We're in 191 countries, and I think the model of having a denominational partnership with Enterprise is something I would love to see. I would love to explore.
Thank you, Bishop. Appreciate it. Other thoughts? We got about 5 minutes left. Other thoughts that people have on how the faith community can get involved around policy work?
Yeah, one of the things that I've been encouraging congregations, we talked about this at our Pastors and Shepherds Conference back in Oklahoma City. We held a forum there, and one of the things that I think is very important is to know the policy decisions that are being made in your communities and start to activate your congregants to participate. There are folks that have some aptitude, hopefully, in some of our congregations that could be sitting on planning commissions, that could be sitting on redevelopment authorities, that can be sitting in some of these spaces as some of the decisions are being made to understand how some of the land use choices will affect our congregations and be at the table advocating for them. I also think that our congregations are often the first line of information in our communities, whereas policymakers are often looking at historical data to inform them on decisions that they're making. And as pastors, as religious leaders, your congregants are giving you real-time data with the trauma that they're dealing with in their communities that can oftentimes inform real policy. And I'll use an example of South Haven, Mississippi, where one of our congregations there, Bishop Vincent Matthews, had a member fall through the floor of her second-story apartment at 5 months pregnant due to a high-risk pregnancy, and found out that apartment was infested with mold and other issues. And as a result of them marching 300 of their congregations on that facility, they got phone calls from all over the region from people who were asking for that church's assistance because more than 22,000 units of housing in the Memphis, South Haven, Mississippi region were condemnable. but couldn't be condemned because there's a housing crisis there. And if they condemned them, people would be on the streets. And so it highlighted a policy issue that if that church hadn't have marched, they wouldn't have brought attention to that issue both nationally and then started to attract some dollars and bring in some resources to that community. So I think oftentimes our churches can be a voice of some of those issues that oftentimes policymakers won't hear about in real-time data.
Thanks, Derek. Pastor Green?
You know, I think that what I'm thinking about is my good friend, Reverend Tim Warner. And David, I'm pretty sure you know Reverend Warner. I'm going to make it more local, even what we've talked about. You've got to preach about it. You've got to teach on it. You've got to pray about it publicly and privately. We are movement builders. We are not monument builders, right? And so this is not about just building a building. It's about building a movement in our congregations that spills out from our houses of worship and into our communities to create exponential change. And if we're not helping people make the connection between our faith and scripture and our responsibility to eradicate poverty and ensure that everybody has equitable housing, no matter what we do, no matter how many units we build or how many dollars we raise, we've built a monument and not a movement. And so that's the work that I think is really before us. There is not a single portion of scripture that doesn't direct us to do this work. And so whether you are actually building affordable housing, whether you are simply educating the people who will go forth from your congregation and build affordable housing, whether you're getting elected or you're showing up and advocating for your elected officials, helping your congregations and your people have the language they need to bring their faith to bear in this moment around these issues is absolutely critical.
Pastor Green, thanks. Mohammed, we'll give you and Roberta last word. We got about 2.5 minutes left. So Mohammed, we'll go to you and Roberta. If there's a final word you may want to offer up, we'll let you do that. Go ahead, Mohammed.
Yeah, definitely. I shared in the chat, which I think they'll share with participants later, but there was a paper that we wrote on the Jordan Court development in Berkeley, which was built on church land. It was the first multifamily development in Berkeley in 30 to 40 years. And it was done because the congregation and the church really pressured the city to build that housing there in a very high opportunity area. And that was kind of like a catalyst of this movement, of a very pro-housing movement within the city of Berkeley, which now is trying to eliminate single-family zoning, allow for missing middle housing options, so it's just more affordable for home ownership and for renters. So we're seeing is that what we're seeing in California is that a lot, and in San Diego, a lot of the YIGBY, yes, in God's backyard, movement led to the creation of SB4. So we're seeing like churches coming up and rising, and they're passing this movement more policy, local level, state level. At the federal level, we have bipartisan bills that are being passed just to induce more church and faith-based organized land. And the best thing about congregations is that they're in both parties. They're Democrats and they're Republicans. And housing is historically not as much of a partisan issue, but it's very helpful within these communities. I mean, the word of thumb is that local politicians listen to two groups of people: realtors and the church. So you have this power that you could leverage, that you could help start this kind of just pro-housing movement within your communities, and later it's going to fester and grow throughout the whole city, and we will see more housing solutions to the problems that we face as a society. So keep pushing.
Appreciate it. Roberta, is there a last word you may want to offer for us before we close out here?
I guess just to add, all politics are local, and we see that Senator Peterson talked about that earlier in the first panel with the Faith Action Network participating in the passage of that bill. There are coalitions in Washington state at the local and state level that are meeting with representatives and senators, making sure that their issues are being known and fighting for local policies in their own neighborhoods to enable them to do this work.
Roberta, thanks. And I'll mention very quickly, there are two books that have some interesting takes on how faith community gets involved in things. One is by Bishop J.W. Macklin, called The Canvas of Tomorrow. And another one is a book called Gone for Good, edited by Mark Elsden. Both have good collection of insights around how faith community can get involved in things ranging from actual development to engagement around policy and all the above. So encourage folks to take a look at that. Listen, want to thank my co-moderator here, Jess Blanche. Huge word of thanks for her joining us from the West Coast, and to our panelists, Mohammed Alameldin, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Mohammed from the Terner Center, Reverend Will Pastor Willard Green from the Silver Spring United Methodist Church in Silver Spring, Maryland, Bishop R.C. Hugh Nelson, pastor of Ebenezer Urban Ministry Center, Roberta Scher, also from the good state of Washington Beacon Development Group, and Derek Scott joining us from the Church of God in Christ. Many thanks to all the panelists for being with us today and for a great conversation. We are excited and honored to be wrapping our conversation today by our closing plenary speaker is Acting HUD Secretary Adrienne Todman. I've had the pleasure of working with the Acting Secretary when she led the DC Housing Authority. She has had a distinguished career working to provide housing opportunities for low-income households across our country. She is known for her acumen, for her serious approach, and her commitment to results. Very grateful for her taking the time to join us today to offer her perspectives. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Acting Secretary Adrienne Todman.
Thank you so much, David, and I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, greetings, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be. And, you know, David, you had me at hello when the invitation came for me to participate in this. Two things. One, you know, David not just talks the talk, but walks the walk, if you know this brother. And he has been doing this work in terms of bringing housing issues and faith-based organization for many, many years, and has done so very well. I saw it in action while I was working at the local level at the Housing Authority, and the number of collaborations we had really doing exactly what this entire forum is about, is bringing housing affordability on faith-based properties to people who need it the most. So I want to continue to congratulate you, Mr. Bowers, for the extraordinary leader you are and the leadership that you bring to many people who are trying so hard to figure out how this very complex world of housing works. I had the opportunity to sit in very briefly during your last panel, and it looks like you all brought together some of the superstars of ways to sort of demystify this and to create avenues of understanding and knowledge for people who just want to figure out, how do we get started? This is by far one of my favorite topics to talk about, because I have seen across the country that the capacity to improve the housing condition for people, so much of it will be solved by galvanizing our faith-based organizations and our faith-based leaders, and not because of the land and the opportunity to do so, but also because of the genuineness and the authenticity that faith-based organizations bring to this very topic. So I'm excited to be here to close out what I'm sure was a fabulous last couple hours of learnings. Look, you know, faith-based organizations and leaders are true anchors in their communities. And the way that I see it, a faith-based organization is not just the house of worship. It's not even the people inside the house who are worshiping. It is the community that comes and is born of all of that. Whether it's helping the homeless, whether it's helping somebody find food, whether it's in this season of giving, making sure that little ones have gifts. I know that faith-based organizations have always been anchors in their communities. So introducing this concept of one more thing, which is providing permanent shelter to families who need it, is just part of the overall ministry. And certainly a part of HUD's mission is making sure that you are successful in doing that, because it means that HUD's goals are completed through your work. You know, it was said earlier that a lot of building things and getting things done don't happen at the federal level, and that is absolutely true. But let me tell you the superpowers that we have. You know, one of the things that brings me joy about being in this position and serving in the Biden-Harris administration from the start in 2021 is how we've been trying so very hard to really push the envelope when it comes to the tools, the programs, and access to the things that we do here at HUD. And let me say at the start here that we are not just housing. our title is Housing and Urban Development, which I will rename Community Development right now because we do so much work with our rural neighbors. So we do a little bit of everything to support all of the efforts that were mentioned throughout the day here. I mean, first and foremost, of course, we help to provide the building of housing. And I'm not going to go through the litany of our different programs. I encourage you to visit our website. And David, what I will do is we created a common sense sort of catalog of HUD's programs. That's not quite in HUD speak, so that folks are able to see the number of different things we do. So I will make sure that you have access to that so you can send it to this audience. But we certainly help to build. And the comment that was made earlier, which is spot on, is what has been happening in terms of funding housing affordability over the past several years. It is true, we are not funding as much as we should, but I am here to say, as somebody who has been in this industry now for 30 years, the level of intentionality born from, sadly, the crisis that we're in, but the level of intentionality across the departments here in the Biden-Harris administration have been really really vigorous. One of the things that we did about 2 years ago is created a housing supply action plan, and part of that was bringing together all the departments' efforts to put all of our tools on the table to make sure that we were providing localities and states with information and tools and access to funding in a way that was accessible. So I encourage folks to Google, Biden-Harris Housing Supply Action Plan, and what you will see is the number of different ways that we've been supporting local electeds and other nonprofits and state electeds across the government to provide smarter programming. There was an opportunity back in 2022, end of 2021, where this country had the opportunity to put historical levels of housing investment to the tune of $150 billion. That package did not make it across the line, but it wasn't because this administration wasn't leaning into it. We have to work with our partners up on Capitol Hill, but that package is still there. And I would encourage all of you who care about housing advocacy at the national level to go back to some of the fabulous ideas that were in there. So we're not starting from scratch all over again. It was everything from homelessness to homeownership. And I think that body of work and that opportunity, probably in different ways and places, will be able to manifest itself in the future. And I'm going to put that out there. So we provide funding certainly to build. We've provided more home funding, which is the federal government's largest grant program to build affordable housing. We have put more home funding out there than in the recent past. We have a reestablished program with our partners at Treasury that's called our Risk Sharing, a federal financing bank risk sharing initiative, where we work with the state housing finance agencies. And it's a tool that's a new tool in their toolbox to create sometimes smaller scale infill housing where it's needed. But it's a tool that we worked really hard with Treasury to reestablish, and it is there for you and your development partners to use. One of the things that many people don't know is states received, well, you probably know this part, states received billions of dollars in American Rescue Plans to help address the public health issues and the impact of our public health issue via the pandemic. And one of the things that we did at HUD, working again with our partners as Treasury, was we found a way to repackage those funds and provide technical assistance to mayors and county executives and to governors to use the funds that were not yet spent to do gap financing for housing. And some of those funds have shown up in different initiatives like Home Key in California. It was, let's say, in the state of Nevada, they provided the state's largest grant funding through the American Rescue Plan funds because of that collaboration. So there's funds that are out there in different pockets and spaces that may not be terribly visible to you, but I wanted to give you the sense of the work that's been happening at the national level. We help pay for operating costs. So you might build it. We have to figure out, well, how are we going to help low-income people, working class people, middle class people with their rent and provide the operating costs subsidy that's needed to make sure a building is something that is sustainable. And so for the first time in probably over 20 years or so, we were able to provide local and state housing agencies with net new housing choice vouchers, which some of you may know can be project-based for many of the deals that you're probably trying to get across the line. And this is the first time that the Housing Choice Voucher Program has been increased, like I said, in 20 years. And we're proud of that effort as well. And certainly we need more. We absolutely need more. But it's important to just put that mark in the sand of the efforts that we took on. Home ownership. Many people are ready to rent. Excuse me, many people are ready to purchase their home. I encourage all of you to, if you have folks in your fold who are ready, encourage them to come and learn more about FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. We are considered a counter-cyclical tool, which means that when things aren't going right in the private sector, FHA can be your home. In fact, even though we've had such a complex homeownership environment over the past couple of years, we've been able to help almost 3 million first-time homeowners in just the past several years. So certainly FHA is a tool for people who want to become first-time homeowners, and we've made some really common sense changes in ways that the mortgage insurance is underwritten to make sure that we're providing maximum opportunity for people who otherwise would not be able to access homeownership. The work that we've done to help our homeless brothers and sisters. Look, we know that homelessness continues to go up, but the one bright spot that we are aware of is homelessness for veterans has consistently gone down. And with our friends in Veterans Affairs, we announced a couple of weeks ago that one more time veterans homelessness has gone down over the past year. And why is that happening? That is happening because there is intentional tools and funding to address veterans' homelessness. So we know it's possible to help our families with children, to help our homeless individuals, to help our homeless folks who are seniors. We know it's possible to help folks get homes with the right level of resources to support them. And we know that because we see what's happening in terms of decreasing homelessness amongst our veterans, brothers and sisters. We continue to make the fight on fair access. If you built the rental housing, if you're providing homeownership, we want to make sure that people have fair access to it. Look, my time in this seat is going to sunset on January 20th. So my call to action for so many of you is not just to make sure that we're fighting for the funding, but to make sure we're fighting for fair and equal access to the things that are being built and the people who need these homes the most. One area that's really important to me as a daughter of the Caribbean is disaster recovery. If there's anything that can really, reverse the impact of anything we're talking about right now to reduce housing, the lack of housing, affordable housing, it is when whole neighborhoods, whole communities, whole homes, so whether they're rental or home ownership, is wiped out, whether it be a hurricane or a wildfire, whether it be a tornado or flooding. That moment when people look at their community and realize, I have to start all over again, and not just me, my neighbors, my whole community, is devastating. I was able to go over to Maui right after the wildfires. I was down in Florida and in New Jersey after Ian. I was in Asheville after Hurricane Helene. It is traumatic for many, many people. And one of the things that HUD does, and it's important for me to share this with you, is we are in the disaster recovery work. Why is that critical? It's critical because it is our funding that is responsible for making sure that after that disaster happens, that there is money there to rebuild people's homes, that there's money there to rebuild the rental community for people to come back. And so it's critical for all of us to continue to support those initiatives. That money doesn't necessarily show up in your localities as HUD disaster recovery money, but know that even today, we have an ask to our friends in Congress for $12 billion to help with disasters that's happened since 2023, all the way up to Helene and Milton. And so that is part of HUD's ministry as well. You know, there's a faith-based office here at HUD. Some of you may be familiar with that. And it is being led right now by a career staffer. Her name is Dr. BJ Douglas. So there is a space for you here at HUD, and certainly my friends at Enterprise, but there's certainly a space here at HUD for you to learn more about the tools that we have and the initiatives that we have underway. Look, let me end with this. And it's a quote from St. Augustine, who is the namesake of my home church here in Washington, D.C. Patience is the companion of wisdom. And I know so many of you here are participating because you know it is wise to do everything you can to help with shelter for not just the people who walk through your houses of worship, but for your whole communities. And as somebody who has been in this fight for a long time, it is going to require a degree of patience. Now, don't be fight urgently, but it will require a degree of patience to get things across the line. So don't be dissuaded when somebody says no. Don't get discouraged when somebody says we need a little bit more gap financing. Don't be concerned or afraid of leaning in when it looks like it's something so complex and difficult to understand. There is a whole housing community that is here to help you. And we absolutely need to lock arms and make sure that we're doing this great work together. So I want to thank you all for inviting me here today. Thank you again, David, for your courageous leadership. And know that while my title goes away on January 20th, I will be here forever to be a resource for you, David, and anybody else who calls. I hope that you all stay well and have a blessed holiday season.
Acting Secretary Adrian Todman, thank you so very much for your words, your kind words, your thoughtful words, and even more importantly, your continued commitment and service in this space. It really is inspirational. And for you to end with St. Augustine, that's, you know, in effect, you know the room. You know the room in the audience. That's good. So we appreciate that. One of my favorite reads in seminary. So thank you again, really, for all the work you've done. And we know you'll continue to be laboring in the vineyard. So we thank Acting Secretary Adrian Todman for making time to be with us today. Last couple of minutes, I just want to end with a quick word of thanks and a quick word of hopefully encouragement. First, let me start off with thanks. I want to thank my colleagues, Andrea Russell, Claire Wee, Jemima O'Cherry, Amanda Walls, Diane Cho, John Caraquillo, who have been behind the scenes really working in various ways to pull this off to get today. So thank you all so much for being behind the scenes, and thanks to my chairman and CEO and President Sean Donovan for being with us today. I want to thank all of you all who've tuned in to listen today. Your time is important, and all those who will hear this and to take the time to listen to this in the future, thank you, because it does take an investment of time to get informed and to get inspired. I want to thank all of the speakers, all of the panelists who've been with us today. Thanks again to our sustaining sponsor, Wells Fargo, and our presenting sponsor, Capital One, for their support. We really do hope that the discussion that was heard today has offered information and inspiration. There's an old spiritual that I used to love to hear sung when I attended People's Congregational United Church of Christ in Washington, D.C., where the choir would sing, "You hear the lambs a-crying, O shepherd, feed of my sheep." And so the bad news is that there is much need in the land. When it comes to housing, millions of Americans are struggling every day with high housing cost burdens. But the good news is that the faith community is well poised with the land it stewards to help meet these needs through the creation of new housing that is affordable to low and moderate income households. And we've heard about both rental and ownership. With the right information and the right support, we are seeing examples across the country of this reality. I encourage, my colleagues at Enterprise encourage all of us to stay faithful in this work to expand the faith-based development movement that we've heard about today, from efforts to enact policies at the local level, the state level, the federal level, and also in the boardroom that support work to investments by public and private sector, to engagement by the faith community. We can hear the cry, so let us answer the call. God bless you all.